Hey folks, Roger here. I am on break from school for the Christmas holiday, and I've had some friends ask me to share in a discussion why it is that I'm a Christian. And I would like to try to give you the summary version of this, but keep in mind that this is not a tidy timeline I'm trying to summarize for you. I will not argue in this video that Christianity is true. I won't try to convince anyone. But what I'd like to do is share with you why it is that I was almost not a Christian, and why it is now that I am utterly convinced that Christianity is true. That's been a long journey. And I would like to say also, I have many ideas for the future, for discussions that we can have about the great ideas from the history of world thought and how those ideas have worked together, the main philosophical voices in that conversation, how these ideas have shaped and influenced the world we live in today. And we can talk about things like modernism, what it is, postmodernism, what it is, how it started, how it's shaping culture today, conservatism, liberalism. We can talk about things like what the Christian doctrine of the Trinity is, whether or not it's illogical, why people began to believe in it, and I can offer books that might be helpful to you in understanding these things a little bit more. But to be quite frank, I am a very busy person, so those things will be forthcoming very likely months from now. So I am not big on the idea of self-promotion, but if you're interested in future conversations, not so much to hear what I have to say, but I can summarize some of these great ideas to you and recommend books for you to carry on in your own studies and thought. I would suggest that you consider hitting subscribe, just so that when these conversations eventually do come out, you'll be notified of it. So, why am I a Christian? Well, let me give you a summary, a little bit about myself. I grew up in a home that had Christian elements in it. My mother had me read the scriptures from the time I was very young, and though I did not understand them all, didn't always even, I think, believe everything in them, questioned quite a bit, she had me read the Bible from a young age, and I learned a lot. My parents, at times, encouraged me to attend church and to have and to pray and things like this, and so there were those Christian elements in my home that were sort of ingrained in me from my youth. So Christianity was somewhat natural to the life I grew up with. It wasn't until I was about 15 or so years of age that I got very faithful in a very conservative church in the South. And the reason Christianity seemed so important to me at the time was because it seemed so relevant. The summary version is I wasn't sure what kind of a man I was supposed to grow into, and I wanted to make sure that I grew into a good man. And Christianity, especially through the type of church I attended, was very, very concerned about emphasizing living a holy life and living righteously and not being involved in sort of immorality or anything that even approaches that. And so those things were actually, I think, very helpful to me at the time, and they seemed very relevant to me. These were going to help me become the man that I wanted to be, and I think in some ways they did, and I'm very grateful for that. But because I was so passionate about my faith at that point, before long I decided that I believed I was being called to become a Christian minister, and so I attended a Bible college, a conservative Bible college in the South, and studied to prepare for Christian ministry. And my wife and I, we got married in my college years. We studied there. But to give you the summary version, since the time I began reading the Bible, I did have some questions about how do I know that this Jesus guy actually existed in history in the first place? How do I know he's even real? But I really felt he was real because I had answers to prayer. I felt in the sermons and in the singing. I felt I was being called to God's presence, things like this. I definitely can give you specific examples of prayers I believe I've had answered. And these things just seem relevant to me. I felt they were true, but I did have these sort of questions. How do I know this is really what this book says is true? When I went to Bible college, I think I thought I was going to get some answers to these questions and get some more of a little bit more of the underlying ideas. Unfortunately, the college I went to, I have many good things to say about that college and the type of Christian tradition it's in. It's in the tradition of Christian fundamentalists who, believe it or not, in the past, fundamentalism has grown out of academia, when very intelligent, highly educated people in the Western civilization's best universities separated, and they were very intelligent people. And believe it or not, there are still some well-read fundamentalists around. But because I was in this movement, they focused on Bible study, studying particular books of the Bible, and then a really applied Christian ministry. They continued the emphasis on the holy Christian living, on evangelistic outreach and things like this. But unfortunately, they did not give me much of any intellectual framework for believing the Christian faith is true to begin with. We rather we didn't start there. We assumed it was true, and we went on. We went on about our business. Unfortunately, this did not help me with the intellectual doubts and questions that I had about how do I know this book is true? How do I know these particular books in the Bible are supposed to be the books in the Bible? How do I know Jesus existed? Etc., etc. And so these questions really actually began to just kind of stack up, and I got more questions and fewer answers. But I still felt Christianity was true. I was very passionate about my faith. I just had this existential feeling of relevance, and I thought God was calling me. And so my wife and I, we accepted a position to serve at a conservative church in the South, and I have many good things to say about that pastor and those people to this day. But the long story short is I had these rather intellectual type of questions in my mind that I never got answers to. When I was in the ministry, I'll tell you what, when you're growing up in the modern world as a child, you really think that, life's pretty good. You have air conditioning, you have Saturday morning cartoons, you have lots of toys. Life's pretty good in the modern world. But not all of it's good. Some of it hurts. And as an adult in the ministry, it really began to set in for me the reality of the human condition, about all the pain and suffering in the world. There were some things in my own life I was disillusioned about, some things I had witnessed or experienced, that I was very confused about how God could let these things happen. And then in the ministry, and preparing for the ministry, I began to talk with people, trying to help them, and I saw the real amount of suffering that they were going through. There was a time when I visited a hospital, and I sat by the bedside of a person who was dying. They just appeared lifeless, being kept alive barely. And their body was a bit crumpled. And the family had asked for me to come and pray for this person. And so I did, but it was a bit shocking to me. This was death. And this experience and the things left over from my younger years, and the things I began to witness, this overbearing feeling of there's so much pain and suffering, I did sort of question how God could let these things happen. Well, then I became exposed to the works of the new atheists. Perhaps you've heard of them. Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens is my favorite, Richard Dawkins, and Daniel Dennett. And I began to read some of the older atheists as well, Bertrand Russell. And I would suggest that if you're interested in atheism, some of these older atheists are a bit more academic and challenging and worth reading. Friedrich Nietzsche, even Mackey, some of these guys. And they would offer arguments against my faith that, unfortunately, even with all of my seminary and Bible college and church training, I was utterly ill-equipped for. I had no intellectual framework for how to defend my faith or why to believe these things in the first place. And so when they offered arguments against my faith, they stacked up, and I had very poor answers to most of their objections. Some of them I knew were sort of hot air, but some of them, if I was honest with myself and trying to understand what was true, eventually I started thinking, well, perhaps these guys are right. But to be very clear, it wasn't just the intellectual arguments. It was also sort of this existential feeling of pain and disillusionment, and seeing the pain around me that drove home with force the arguments that these guys made. For example, one thing that was very difficult for me and is sometimes still, why is it that children suffer? In the modern world, we sometimes rate our success on how well we can hide from the suffering and pain in the world, but there's a great deal of it out there. Whether behind our doors or outside of our doors, there's a great deal of pain in the world. But why do children suffer? And I had learned of this and seen this, of children going through things that they should not go through. And Hitchens would say something like, how is it that God, who sees all and who is all good and can do anything, would stand back, stand apart, and watch a little girl, and he would describe some terrible things that have happened in real life that a particular little girl would go through. How is it that God would stand back and watch what she goes through as she very likely calls out and cries out to him, and he does nothing? How can he be there and do nothing? Perhaps he is not there. And that really resonated with me. So the intellectual arguments that men like Michael Martin would throw at my faith really resonated, especially when I thought about evil, pain. And that's where I was at. And I'm not alone in that. I think most of us experience suffering at some point, and it's tough. In fact, the most skeptical scholar, New Testament scholar alive right now is a man by the name of Bart Ehrman. And he was, at one point in his life, a Christian who studied under the best New Testament scholar in Western civilization, Bruce Metzger. And he was, if I understand it correctly, a pastor of a Baptist church for some time. But he says in his book, God's Problem, that he thinks that the Bible gives contradictory answers for why we suffer, for evil in the world, and all those answers fail. And he says that, he began to lose faith in the Bible, but in the end, it was the reality of evil and suffering that has caused him to lose his faith, and he's a very skeptical person at this point. And that's the similar boat that I was in. Well, I'm trying to summarize here, but what helped me? Well, I reached out to a friend whose name was Nick Peters, who was a guy I met back when I was in Bible college, who was always reading philosophy and history and theology and books about the Bible and everything you can imagine. This guy was reading it. Every time you see him, he has a book in his hands. Well, he was always going on about something that he called apologetics. And what he said was that this was the defense of the Christian faith. Now, when I knew him before, I was studying for Christian ministry. And I thought, man, why do I need that? I'm studying to preach the gospel. I'm studying to minister to folks. Why do I need to defend the Christian faith? I had no interest in it. I had no need for it. I had nothing for it. But years later, flash forward, I was struggling with my faith, and I really had no foundation. So the arguments by the atheists and my problems with suffering, I reached out to Nick and I said, I don't think I was very upfront with him about how close I was to losing my faith altogether. But I sent him a list of pointed questions that were not exactly original to me, but were things like, why does God allow suffering? Why do you believe God exists in the first place? Is the New Testament historically accurate? Did the people in the New Testament, even who wrote the New Testament, even know Christ, or did they write this so long after the events that we can't trust, we have no confidence in these documents? I had even heard the idea that the stories applied to Jesus and his divinity were actually copies from older pagan myths about pagan gods that Christians or perhaps the Catholic Church just copied and pasted. And I asked these questions to Nick, and he did something very wise. He did not give me a summary, quick answer. What he did was he realized that my questions were long-running, that they were complicated and connected and part of a longer history of misunderstandings, and that they were driven home with some existential force for me. So he, instead of giving me a summary answer or a meme, he would say, hey man, go read some books, these books on arguments for God's existence. And what I'll do is you read those and you'll come back and you can talk to me. We can discuss the atheist books you've read and these books. Now, unfortunately, I hadn't been exposed to these kind of arguments for God's existence before. My particular Christian tradition took such a high view of Scripture, and it's something that's admirable to me, and I, to this day, believe in the authority of Scripture, but we had sort of let our particular cultural context eclipse the entire Western tradition of Christian contributions to world thought, of how Western civilization has been largely shaped by Christian thinking and Christian ideas and even the gospel. And we had really forgotten about and overlooked arguments for God's existence or any kind of defense of the New Testament documents, any of these things. How do we know that Jesus existed in history? It's something that even with seminary training, I had no training for this. And that's unfortunate. And Nick knew this, and he walked me through it, and he just said, here are some books. I perhaps should have read them before, but I hadn't, and he just helped me. He said, man, here are some books about the existence of God, about the resurrection of Christ, about various things. Read these if you're serious about this. I can't solve it for you in 5 minutes, and come back and talk to me. Well, it took months. I was very serious, and you see these books behind me. Perhaps you've seen some of the other videos I've made about philosophy and the books from the Western tradition and world thought. Well, Christianity has no doubt been a voice in that, but I'd already been collecting them. Well, he would recommend more books, man. Read something about Aristotle. You need to read more about Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and he'd recommend books to help explain those things to me. And that was helpful to me. But what I found was that while I'm a very busy person, I always have been, I wanted one argument to prove to me that Christianity is true. Unfortunately, contrary to a lot of YouTube video titles, there is no one single argument that you can offer in 5 minutes that will prove Christianity is false. It'll destroy Christianity, all caps in the YouTube video title, right? There is no 10-minute discussion that can prove everything in Christianity is true to you either. That's what I wanted, but that's not how it works. It turns out that the world is a complicated place. And these things take time, and they're worth putting aside lesser things to try to put some effort into reading philosophy, history, theology, the scriptures, and trying to understand the world we live in, to try to understand God and ourselves. And so I was passionate about it, and we went back and forth for months. And while there was no one argument that convinced me, I'm not going to try to convince you here, but let me try to offer you just a summary of what it is that helped me. While my particular tradition had such a high view of the scriptures, focused on the Bible, that this idea that is called inerrancy was so ingrained into me that when I had read the Bible quietly by myself as an adult, and I just compared, for example, the 4 gospel records, and I saw things that happened out of order. In Matthew chapter 4, Christ is tempted by the Satan, who tries to get him to trip up, at one point, literally, and he offers him 3 temptations. In Matthew chapter 4, just as an example, I went through and I wrote them down in order. In Matthew 4, he says, command that these stones be made bread, and Christ, he didn't fall for this temptation, but Satan says, you're hungry, command these stones be made bread, number 1. Number 2, he said, cast yourself down, because it's written that he'll give his angels charge over you, and he'll hold you up. And so this second thing he said was, cast yourself down. The third thing Satan tried to tempt Christ with was, he took him up to a high place, and he showed him all these great cities, and he said, all of this power and glory I'll give to you if you'll just fall down and worship me. And so the order of events is 1, bread, 2, cast yourself down, 3, worship me. Then I flipped over to Luke chapter 4, a parallel account, and it says the first order of event, verse 3 of chapter 4 of Luke, was command these stones be made bread, 2, worship me, 3, cast yourself down. The events were out of order. Now, there are many examples of this in the Bible, in the New Testament. Genealogies that don't seem to quite line up. I was concerned about, historians told me that in Luke chapter 2, there was a census that went out that had to do with the Lord's mother and Joseph. And Irenaeus was the governor of Syria when this census went out. And historians told me that it can't be true, because this has Cyrenius in power and Herod in power, and Cyrenius was the governor, Herod was up here. But Herod had died 10 years before that census started, so Luke was just wrong. Now, these things I have some answers for now, but at the time I was so utterly ill-equipped. And the long story short is that the Bible, when I read it, it disappointed me. It failed to live up to the expectations I had of it. Now, what I would say now is perhaps my expectations were not quite accurate. But at the time, it was rather devastating to me. Another example, I was studying Greek in college, and in my preferred translation of the Bible is the good old Queen's English, beautiful. It's unparalleled in its artistry. Is the King James translation of the Scriptures. Well, in my New Testament, 1 John chapter 5 is a verse, a passage that I thought the entirety of the Christian doctrine of the Trinity rested upon this passage. And when I was reading the Greek New Testament, it wasn't there. The whole passage was gone. To tell you that was disillusioning and that I was distraught would be an understatement. That tore me up. I pretended I have answers and I understood it, but I did not. Long story short, I'm trying to summarize. The Bible, it did not live up to what I expected of it, based on my very high view of inerrancy. I expected a modern history book out of the New Testament. That's not what I got when I read it very carefully. So just privately, it was disappointing to me. And even though I had been preaching this, and I began to doubt it, just like John the Baptist, if you recall the story, he prepared his whole life to preach the gospel. He was preaching the gospel. He had given his whole life to serve, to make the way for Christ. But when his life was on the line from his preaching, he made enemies of political folks in high places. His head was literally about to be on the chopping block. He questioned it. He sent a messenger to Jesus, if you recall, and he said, "Are you the one? Is this true? Are you the Messiah?" And of course, Jesus knew just how to answer him. But the man who preached the gospel the loudest doubted it when his life was on the line. And though my life was on the line, man, I just thought all of this stuff was crumbling. No one of these things was a defeater of my faith, but I just thought, man, it's all leaning against my faith and it's just going to topple over. So what Nick did was he very wisely gave me books about the historical reliability of the New Testament, how treated just objectively as historical documents, they're historically reliable in comparison to other historical documents. We have far more manuscripts for the New Testament than other historical documents that we take. Say, for example, Plutarch, or all kinds of things. We'll perhaps talk about these things in another video. But he gave me books to read on these by real scholars that helped me. But even though one argument did not prove the existence of God to me, let me show you what happened. Perhaps you've heard of the cosmological argument. That one I had heard of before I talked to Nick. Really, what it turns out is these arguments are actually categories, families of arguments. And there are many different versions of the cosmological argument. And what the cosmological argument, in a very basic, quick form, is that every effect happens because of a cause, and if you just trace cause and effect back, there must eventually be a first cause on which every other effect is based. Now, that did not convince me, of course, that Christianity is true, but I took the point. Okay, so very likely everything goes on forever, or it makes far more sense to think that at some point the buck has to stop and that there must be a first cause. Of course, I poked holes in my mind and all this. How do I know that's God? What does that mean? What does that have to do with Jesus? But I took that point and studied various forms of the cosmological argument. There's a form of the cosmological argument called the Kalam cosmological argument, which basically takes contemporary science, models of physics, and shows that since the 1940s, physicists have come to think that the universe had a beginning. Space-time began at some point in the finite past. It's rather difficult to wrap your head around that. Does that prove that Christianity is true? No. But I took that point. And basically what I saw was that each argument could relate to something that was observable in the real world, but also matched, it seemed to me, the picture that Christianity painted of the world, of God and myself. In other words, let's say, for example, that if the universe began to exist out of nothing, does that prove that Christianity is true? No. But that is exactly what you would expect if Christianity is true. Leibniz was a man who co-invented calculus, a very smart guy. He's has a lot to do with the modern scientific thinking. Um, he asked the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, what does that mean? It means that the universe does not have to exist. It's a contingent reality. The world is full of things that are contingent. They depend upon something else for their existence. I depend upon my parents for my initial existence, right? Well, the world itself is a contingent existence. The world itself did not have to exist. And yet it does exist. Why? Does this prove to me that Christian theism is true, that the Bible is true? Of course not. But these things started to make sense to me. Well, they seem to make sense with the Christian world picture. The universe seems to have had a beginning, and space and time seems to have had an absolute beginning in the finite past. Why is there something rather than nothing? What about why is the universe rational? In other words, why is the universe rationally comprehensible? Our minds, we assume, by you watching this video, we are assuming that, by you watching that there is someone here who can communicate to your mind ideas about the world. And I'm assuming that I am communicating words and ideas from my mind to real people, or at least to my phone. But the world is comprehensible. We can communicate about it. It's rational. It's nuanced. It's complicated. There are things in the quantum realm we don't understand, but yet the world is, in some basic fundamental way, a rational reality. It didn't have to be. Why is it? Does that prove to me that Christianity is true? No. But the Christian tradition has long held from the scriptures that while Plato thought that Logos was something else, the Christian said, no, God is the Logos. He is the pre-existent rationality behind the universe, who pre-existed the universe. And out of his rational existence, he brought into existence a rational cosmos. And so it's comprehensible, it's rational. And so it just made sense. These things began to interlock for me. No one argument proved it for me, but they began to make sense. Now, Thomas Aquinas was a 13th century, I believe, medieval thinker, and he was living in a very interesting time intellectually, while Platonism had been the predominant view in academia, even though Christianity was the religious faith of the time in Western civilization, Platonism had sort of reign and had been sort of mixed with Christian ideas in many ways. And that's perhaps not the best way to say that. But Aquinas lived in a time when Aristotle's work had been rediscovered and his system of logic seemed to resonate again with the way things are in the world. So Aquinas took this. He had discussions about natural law that influenced the later thinkers like John Locke and the American founding fathers that, of course, influenced the Constitution. But Aquinas used this Aristotelian models of logic, and he had something called the 5 ways. And what these are 5 arguments for the existence of God. Some folks would say these are 5 proofs that God exists. Others would say that these are 5 ways that show that belief in God is a very logical thing, that the existence of God is rationally coherent with the world we observe. Well, so I was studying these arguments in some books that my friend Nick had recommended to me by modern thinkers trying to hash out Aquinas, because I had misunderstood Aquinas in college. One of those arguments, after I think of 3 days or so of thinking about it, the logic was so convincing to me, it clicked to me, that if God exists in the way that this argument says, then God does not exist just as a deist-type God who stands apart from this mechanistic universe. This is the way the founding fathers would have thought of the United States. Rather, God is everywhere. And everything that happens, the change and the motion in this world today is dependent upon a sort of first pure actuality. If there is potential for movement today, I have the potential to move my hand, right? But it doesn't become actual until I actually move it. Well, the world is full of potentialities. You wind it all the way back, not just in time, but logically, causally. There must be a pure actuality, and this pure actuality has no potentiality. It's technical, but it lined up with what the Old Testament had said about God, who is self-existent. He said, I am. this thing sort of clicked for me, and I realized as I'm sitting in my room and I'm reading this book, questioning God's existence, the logic clicked, and I saw that I thought the premises were true, and that the conclusion followed coherently from these premises. As I question God's existence, I'm depending upon his existence. And that was a rather frightening thing for me. So if there was one argument that did really come drive it all home for me, it was that one. And so what I saw was that Christianity has many arguments from the Western tradition that shows the rational coherence of major Christian claims with the world I observe. And so it showed me that at least Christianity is very rational, if not very plausible. Does that mean that everything in Christianity in the Bible is true? No, but I hope you see where this started to help me. The second major point was Nick helped me prioritize my beliefs. Whereas before, if I thought that the earth turns out to be old rather than young, well, that had been tied to the gospel by certain well-meaning people. And if the earth turned out to be older than 6,000 or 10,000 years, the gospel was defeated or at least damaged. I learned to sort of prioritize these things. And I asked a question: what must be true in order for Christianity to be true? Well, if God exists and Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is true. Because if God exists and Jesus rose from the dead and the earth is billions rather than thousands of years old, is Christianity true? Yeah. What it would be affected? Well, perhaps the Bible is wrong. I don't think it is, but perhaps. But Christianity at some fundamental level is still true if those two things are true. Perhaps my interpretation of the scriptures isn't quite right. What if I find one error in the gospel writers that seems to be an error to me and I just can't reconcile it? Well, if God exists and Jesus rose from the dead, then maybe my view of inerrancy is affected. And now, to be clear, I've come back to the point in my life, full transparency, in which I believe in the authority of Scripture. You can't just take a passage out of context, but when you take the Bible comprehensively, what it concludes on this topic, I believe is authoritative for Christians. And that informs the way I view culture today about morality and things of this nature. But, intellectually speaking, from an argument's perspective, if I were to find one thing in the New Testament, maybe perhaps Luke got something wrong, does it defeat my entire faith? No. If God exists and Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true. It affects secondary things or tertiary things. I hope this makes sense to you. And so I sort of prioritized my belief, and I focused on the things that must be true, and I investigated them. And we don't have time to go into it here, but I investigated as best as I could the resurrection, the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. And there's no credible scholar, really very few, if any, that think that Jesus did not exist in history. I just didn't know that from my training. Even the most skeptical scholar, Ehrman, thinks that Jesus of Nazareth existed in history. There's plenty of evidence for that for another time. But I investigated as best as I could whether or not he rose from the dead. I read doctoral dissertations. I read atheist arguments by Michael Martin against the resurrection. I watched YouTube videos by internet atheists. I read Michael Kona's book and Gary Habermas's book, N.T. Wright's book, which is a beast, man. But eventually I concluded, man, this makes a lot of sense based on all the arguments, all the data. It's very plausible that it seems to me that this man, literally, not in a fairy tale way, got out of the grave. Now, of course, that seems absurd, but if there is a God who is everywhere and who interacts in nature and who is in this room right now and who doesn't stand apart from creation as a deist thought, then it isn't totally implausible that he could act in nature. And if the evidence shows that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, I have to take this seriously because God might be acting in the world. Now, I'm not trying to convince you here. I'm summarizing the arguments we might talk about some of the time, but these things at some point became extremely plausible to me. Now, at this point in my life, it's not only plausible to me, I am utterly convinced. I've done my best to be open-minded to past worldviews, to Islam, to Buddhism, to Hinduism, especially to atheism. But at this point in my life, I am utterly convinced that Christianity is true. But at the time, I thought, man, this is super plausible. These categories of arguments, be it the ontological argument, cosmological, etc., show that these individual portions of the Christian world picture seem to line up with what is rational. And it does seem very plausible that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. Now, one thing I'd like to talk about is that's why I was almost not a Christian, and here's what ultimately sort of tipped me over towards remaining a Christian. But at the end of the day, Christianity is not about philosophy or history, so to speak. Christianity is about a person. Now, for sake of argument, assume with me for the moment that Christianity is true. What are the implications for this? Some of the best people I've ever met in this life are dead. They're gone. Now, if I go with Friedrich Nietzsche and I think there is an abyss, everything is conceived in the will to power, everything that we do out of kindness is really a mask, and everything's really about, it's all power play. And really, ultimately, life is an abyss, and when you stare into it long enough, the abyss stares back into you. And if I go with Jean-Paul Sartre, who was an existentialist atheist Frenchman who followed Nietzsche, then life is absurd. There is no morality, there is no meaning. We are damned to be free, Sartre thought. We must choose our own meaning, we must choose our own path. But in the end, it's all, as Sartre concluded, it is absurd. Human existence is a painful, meaningless, absurd thing, and we're damned to be free to navigate it. Well, those people I know who are dead, if Sartre and Nietzsche are right, their lives are absurd and meaningless. But if Christ is right, if Christ is true, the central claim of the Christian message is that he rose from the dead bodily, and he offers us hope. My grandfather is one of the best men I've ever known, and I miss him often. So this is no joke to me. If Christ rose from the dead, I don't believe my grandfather is in heaven because I don't believe that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead because I want my grandfather to be in heaven. Rather, I've thought through it that, man, if Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead, what does it mean for me? It means my grandfather, who knows Christ, is in heaven. His life was not absurd. His pain, while he might have faced some senseless pain and evils in his life was not meaningless. And goodness goes on, and I can try to repeat the good things that he did in my own life. And there's hope, and I'll see him again one day. So the resurrection of Christ is existentially relevant for me. It changes the way I see the afterlife. The earliest Christians realized that if Jesus of Nazareth did not rise from the dead, then just stay home on Sunday. This whole thing doesn't matter anyway, right? But if he did rise from the dead, what are the implications? We have hope. It means that suffering is not the end. It's changed the way I see myself, and it's changed the way I see the pain and suffering in the world. The end of the story in the Christian world picture, and I can't prove this, I'm basing this by faith on what I can study and observe, the logical arguments for God's existence, the data surrounding the resurrection and the life of Christ. But if that world picture is true, the end of the story is that one day God will come back, justice will be done, those who abuse and harm children. There's cosmic justice ingrained into the universe. And immorality is fighting against the fabric of reality. It's not just a social construct, but one day God will enact justice. It means that the little girl who Hitchens talked about who suffered, it means that her pain, while it might be senseless and meaningless in a sense, her life isn't, and that one day God will wipe away her tears from her eyes. There'll be no more crying. There'll be no more death. And the scripture says that God will make all things new. He'll make things the way they were supposed to be. And that's something that does offer hope for me. This is existentially relevant. It's changed the way I see myself at night. It's changed the way I will raise my children. There's lots of things we could talk about here. But, so the bottom line is, Christianity, I think, is explanatorily powerful, and it's also existentially relevant. And so I think the best I've done to study the arguments for and against God's existence, the arguments are far in favor of the existence of God. And I look at Jesus and I think, man, this is someone who I will trust. I think this is true and right. And what else can I do besides look at the evidence and the reason and make a determination based on that? And that's what I've done. And I believe that Christianity is true, and this is why I'm a Christian. I don't want to take any more of your time. There's lots more that could be said here. But I want to say I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about this. I know this is a long video. In the future, perhaps we'll make shorter videos talking about just summaries of certain topics, and I can recommend some books for you to read. But I appreciate your time. God bless you. Take care.